Afternoon, everyone. Let's begin with the session on inadequate analgesia. I'll be briefing really in just 5 minutes so that we get enough time for interactive discussion.
Perfect.
Um, so please, delegates, put your questions in chat box. I don't know whether I can read them, but just please put them. If we go through the literature, we find that the labor analgesia failure rate is as high as 9 to 12%. And even the catheter replacement rate lies between 5 to 13%. So please do not get intrigued by this figure because you can make your block work if you know why the epidural analgesia fails and how to make your failed block work. So with right knowledge, proper technique, and with experience, the success rate can be increased up to 99%. So coming to causes of failure, sometimes our technique may not be correct. Sometimes we get false loss of resistance and the catheter get placed in subcutaneous space. Sometimes we may deviate from the midline and the catheter is placed in lateral epidural space. This is pretty common in obese patient. So I think Dr. Sandeep's talk in the morning will be helpful in such patients. And another important thing is length of the catheter in the epidural space matters. So studies indicate that when the length of the catheter in the epidural space is smaller than 5 centimeter, lesser number of failed block occur. Another important point is catheters do migrate. So, and this is pretty common in labor, and they can migrate to intrathecal space, they can migrate to subdural space, they can get threaded in intravenous compartment, or even they can just go out of epidural space. So it's very, very important that we should not inject more than 5 ml of bolus at a time. And there should be enough time between two boluses. I think since morning, every speaker has been talking about this, and anesthetist presence while giving dosages is important. So incorrect dosages obviously can lead to inadequate analgesia. So sometimes we need to fine tune them according to the individual needs. Sacral sparing is something I think I don't need to explain because we already, Dr. Ravindra sir has said, talked about this. I think I'm audible now, sir. Hello?
You are very much audible.
Yeah, sir, because I couldn't hear anything. Sometimes there is unrealistic expectation from the parturian, and this can lead to dissatisfied experience because the perceived analgesia may not be up to their expectations, or sometimes due to technical problems, initiation of analgesia may take some time. So here, pre-labor or before putting the epidural, we have to counsel them. We have to make it clear that it may not be always possible to give analgesia in first go. Sometimes we may have to manipulate these catheters, or sometimes we may have to recite them. Another thing we have to make it, we have to discuss with them that it's not that they will not feel anything and just have a baby, but they will feel something getting tightened up in their tummy, maybe some pressure. So coming to how to salvage a failed epidural. Whenever we get a call for inadequate analgesia, we have to do prompt evaluation and treatment because every rescue manual takes around 30 minutes. So we have to check the level and distribution of block with a wet spirit swab. We have to discuss with the parturian and locate the site of the pain and take information about the obstetric parameters from the obstetric care provider. So if the patient is not having pain relief right from the beginning, if there is no analgesia right from the beginning, we have to ask a question to ourselves whether the epidural catheter is in the space. And if we ourselves are not confident, it's always better to remove and resite it. Or we can confirm the right placement of catheter in the epidural space by giving a numbing dose. It's around 10 to 12 ml of 0.2% BPVK, but mind that it should not be more than 35 milligram in total. If we give this dose, it should produce pain relief and some numbness bilaterally. If it fails to produce this effect, then it's safe to assume that this catheter's tip of the catheter is in intravenous compartment and we should remove it and resite it. Sometimes in a properly functioning epidural, suddenly patient gets breakthrough pain. Here, we have to rule out other causes of inadequate analgesia which are related to labor, like whether there is any hypertonicity due to fast running oxytocin syndrome, whether the labor has progressed faster than expectation, so there is second sparing, or if the urinary bladder is distended, is there any scar dehiscence, are there in malpositions of presenting part like direct occipito-posterior, or there are any missegment or patchy segment. When we rule out the causes related to labor, then we have to physically examine the catheter insertion size, because sometimes the catheter may get dislodged. And if we suspect the catheter has dislodged, it's always better to resite. Sometimes the epidural catheters are in epidural space, but they do not give inadequate analgesia. Blocks which are lower than T10 will not provide adequate analgesia, so we have to top up and give an extra additional bolus. Sometimes there are missed segments or the block is patchy. Here we have to increase the concentration of local anesthetic, but at the same time, whenever there is patchy block, we have to consider possibility of subdural block also. If the block is unilateral, then we'll have to give an additional dose by making the parturiente lie on her lateral side with less block side independent position. Alternatively, we can withdraw the catheter by 0.5 or 1 centimeter and can add additional dose. So all these maneuvers or effort, we should be able to give pain relief within 60 minutes of troubleshoot call. And if we are not successful, it's always better to go ahead and resite the catheter. But before we resite, we have to discuss with the parturiente, and we have to leave the option with the parturiente. Or if you're working in institution, you can call senior anesthetist and discuss with the parturiente, and then only go ahead with resiting of the catheter. Thank you.
That was good, Anjali.
Yeah.
You concluded also very well. But one thing that is very, very important, and that is, if you have had a patient with inadequate analgesia, there are certain risk management strategies that you have to put in place. Because in today's day and age, apart from you doing what you have done to make it work, it's a potential medico-legal litigation situation.
True.
So whenever you come across a situation like this, where there has been inadequate analgesia, while you are doing what you are doing to make it work, it is very important to communicate with the patient that what is the problem, what do you think is the problem, what are you trying to do, and what are your steps that you are taking to solve it. This involves the patient in their own management. It makes them feel that the doctor is concerned and is equally with me in doing something, as opposed to giving it and going away and say, I'll come after 20 minutes. If it doesn't work, we will see what to do. Being with the patient, communicating, explaining your steps is very, very important. And second thing is documentation. Whatever you have done, whatever steps you have taken, you must document with proper timeline. So in order to explain, because you said very correctly in the beginning, that overall 85% of the epidurals work in almost everyone's hand. Another 12 to 14% of epidurals are the one where a bit of this kind of management is required in order to get them working. But no matter what you do, 1 to 2% epidurals will fail.
True.
So effectively, it's not your fault. You may have fallen into that 1 to 2%. As long as you have documented and given the timeline and explained to the patient, there is no question of malpractice or mismanagement or you not doing adequate work comes into play. So that is something very important. Ravi, you want to add on something?
No, as you rightly said, Ketan, if you have communicated to the patient properly in the beginning itself, that it is possible that you may not get 100% pain relief, or there is a very small percentage of situation wherein you may not get relief at all. And at that time, there are certain management strategies. We are going to put that in place. Maybe we may have to resite the catheter. And these things, if it is communicated earlier and stand by the side of the patient, probably the problems will be less. And maternal satisfaction is a subjective phenomenon. Now, probably there may be a situation wherein the worst of the epidural catheter pain relief, patient may be satisfied very well because you are nicely talking to that patient and you have been with that patient well all the time.
Ravi, can I add something on that?
Yes.
I am doing a talk, proper 20-minute talks on Saturday on the same topic of
Right.
after epidural inadequate pain relief, how do I proceed?
Okay.
And in one of my slides over there, I have shown this. I had a multi who had an excellent pain relief with me for the first delivery. When she came for the second delivery, she insisted that I only come for the epidural. And she asked for me. And as I was not, I didn't get out of the bed from the right side on that day. The epidural did not work that day. And she was uncomfortable for almost 35-40 minutes. By the time I decided that we should recite and, let's just do something about it, because she had a partial pain relief. It wasn't that she had no pain relief where I would have just taken out in the first go. She had partial pain relief, but she was just not comfortable. So by the time I decided to recite it, the obstetrician came and checked and she's fully dilated. So I took her in the delivery room, gave her a bit of Entonox and, managed her, and we delivered. Documented. And next day when I went for my round to see her, I was kind of prepared that I'm going to get a barrage of, galis. And when I went there, I was surprised that there was a bouquet lying for me with a card. And she was profusely thanking me and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I was like, little okay. But in the card, she's written that your words were better than your epidural.
Fantastic.
What she told me is that your epidural was bullshit.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that's great.
But because the way you talked to me, you got me through, it's done, it's over.
Right.
So again, just stressing the point on communication, which is extremely important. And that's what we all need to kind of, as an obstetric anesthetist, inculcate in our habit.
Very nice. So shall we move on? Because we are lagging behind.
There's a question in the chat box.
Yeah.
Which says,
do you use lidocaine for the last stage of labor?
I say yes, if required. There is no harm.
What percentage?
Yeah, the problem with lidocaine is because of its tachyphylaxis and motor block, you cannot keep using it for a continuous labor analgesia. But if it is at last stage of labor where the patient is extremely feeling pain and you are expecting already that the obstetrician is going to use instruments,
okay,
it might be easier to use lignocaine than using bupivacaine in that situation, which will take longer to act. So yes, certainly I use lignocaine sometime up to 1%. And I have certain obstetricians who are actually very forceps friendly. I have one obstetrician who delivers every patient with a forceps, irrespective of whether the patient has taken epidural, not taken epidural, whatever it is. So these are the people, these all come with the clinical practice, but these are the people where I will use lignocaine without any hesitation at all.
What volume? 1% lidocaine, what
1% lidocaine, 5 to 10 ml.
With adrenaline or without adrenaline?
Without adrenaline, with fentanyl.
With fentanyl, 1% lidocaine, plain, 5 to 10 ml.
Correct.
Okay. I know, but this should be done only after the head has sufficiently descended.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
It is for the delivery.
Yes.
It is not in a situation where your patient is 9 or 10 centimeter dilated and still has another hour or two to go, then you not. But on the delivery table, at the time of delivery, when the patient starts complaining of discomfort and you know that there is going to be an instrumentation or something like that, and if the patient is uncomfortable, yes, certainly you can use lignocaine.
Yes. It acts in about 3 minutes or 4 minutes time.
So between two contractions, already sort of started working.
Yes, it works very well. Yes. Shall we move on?
Yes, I guess so, because there is no other question on inadequate analgesia. So
the next session is, oh yes, myself. It's me. Okay, let me share the screen. Let me share my screen. Is it seen?
yes.
Yes. So the next session is on the discussion session on total or high spinal. Now, this is a nightmare for every anesthesiologist, whether it is for labor analgesia or anywhere. You are doing your spinal, you are doing your epidural, and a total and a high spinal is a nightmare for you. It is always true. Now, the question is, in the process of pregnancy, labor, delivery, labor analgesia is considered only a luxury. Most of the patients, relatives, even obstetricians feel that it is only a luxury and is not an essential process. This is what they think. At that level, what happens is here people have zero tolerance to any kind of complications. So you need to be very cautious to prevent total spinal, high spinal. So the chances of injecting a large volume intrathecally or catheter migration, always, as Ketan puts it, every dose should be a test dose. Always fractionate your dose so that you're controlling the volume that you inject. You should be very, very careful about that. So that's number one. Number one, prevention of total or high spinal. All this time, Anjali has spoken about a condition wherein you expect some amount of the action epidurally and it doesn't happen. Now I'm talking about something which you expect certain amount of action and much in excess comes. What you want, much in excess is coming. And that's what is total or high spinal. The causes could be the accidental intrathecal migration. A large volume of the drug that you want to give epidurally has entered the subarachnoid space. Intrathecal migration during the process, and then you give the same intrathecal dosage. And more importantly, a subdural catheter. See, the catheter, if it either enters the subdural space at the time of insertion or migrates to the subdural space later on, produces a subdural catheterization. Now, accidental intrathecal injection, it is a little easier to differentiate. So to differentiate between subdural to intrathecal high spinal is one important thing. In intrathecal, you get 100% pain relief. When you give an epidural, a large dose of epidural dosage intrathecally at the lumbar level, you get excellent analgesia. At the same time, hypotension, bradycardia, and all problems of high spinal. Whereas in subdural, you don't get analgesia also. You have a patient with a hypotension, a patient who cannot breathe, patient who can't lift her hands. Somewhere in the cervical level, there is analgesia. Cervical level, there is anesthesia. And lumbar level, there is nothing. So the patient is having pain, patient is having hypotension. Now, this is a very difficult situation. So there, management has to be like, you have to be very careful. Your ABC management of hypotension, management of bradycardia, all these things are important. And one most important thing, which is normally forgotten, is the left uterine displacement. This is very, very important. Every person knows how to manage hypotension, total spinal, during a herniorrhaphy, during a hydrocele surgery, but they tend to forget left uterine displacement in case it is there in pregnancy. So this is a very important thing. To a left uterine displacement and to the rest of the things side by side. Subdural catheter, you remove the catheter, carefully place an epidural in a higher space. Remember, the arachnoid membrane may rupture into the subarachnoid space and could cause a cardiac arrest on table also. The subdural dosage, arachnoid ruptures and it becomes intrathecal later on. So that is also a possibility you need to remember about it. Usually happens in 2 to 3 minutes. It is intrathecal, good analgesia, motor block, hypotension, intrathecal. Management high, like any other high block. manage it as an intrathecal if it is necessary for analgesia. This is subdural placement, subdural catheters. Management is conservative. Remove the catheter. Analgesia is urgent. You can give a single shot spinal. Observe carefully for recovery of the block. And I think we'll take up questions now, if you have questions.
First of all, thank you for the organizers, Ravi, Ketan, and Sunil, for allowing me and inviting me. I truly enjoy this and being involved. It's been lovely listening to all of you talk about how safety is important and how communication is important and how making sure you keep the patient safe, make sure you practice your anesthesiology or your medicine in the circumstance that your location allows is very, very important. I think we should remember that very particularly. And I was asked to kind of open this topic. I mean, this is going to be totally interactive, so there's not much I have. I just have one slide for you. I was asked to talk about bloody tap and management of LAST, or local anesthetic systemic toxicity. Bloody tap. It could be a minor nuisance when you see blood coming out. And I'm going to talk about how when you place an F2E needle, you sometimes are not possibly midline, and you get drip, 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 a lot of blood come out. And then for a minute, if you have a resident with you, they start wondering what in heaven happened. Did they tap into the vena cava or something? And then the other aspect could be extremely hazardous if not recognized, like intravascular placement of an epidural catheter and the patient getting multiple boluses or one single large bolus and causing significant and catastrophic hazard to the patient. So that's one of those things. The whole deal is trying to avoid, there's not a great one single way to avoid intravascular placement of an epidural catheter. There have been multiple studies, and there's one study that I kind of refer back to every time I talk about, think about intravascular placement, is the one that came out of Brigham and University of Michigan, Brigham Women's Dr. Lawrence Sen and Linda Polly from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, that looked at multiple studies in a large number of patients and recognized there were some factors that actually made it a little bit better, and that they describe as placing the epidural catheter with the patient on their side, which is not a common position we see in the United States as far as I've seen. Yes, I was listening to the topic when you said we usually do it sitting, but we also try and get them to do it laying down. We try to do that too. We try to get the junior residents to try and learn how to place an epidural and be safe with it and bolus it properly and troubleshoot it, doing all this with the patient sitting up. And then after they are reasonably comfortable placing an epidural, we try to put the patient on their sides. But our patients, it might be intravascular and you place a whole large bolus in a rather reasonably quick progression. Even if it's multiple boluses, you might go over the toxic level and cause problems. And that's exactly when you don't want to have problems with heart rate abnormalities in the fetus and heart rate abnormalities in the mother. So
I think, Ketan, shall we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any questions coming up.
Yeah,
I just one thing I want to reiterate here. Abhinav and Ravi,
yes,
about the intravascular placement. There was a very good video shown by Dr. Geeta.
yes,
And I have been practicing this for last 25 years. What we do, or rather what I do, is after placing the epidural, we raise the epidural catheter above the level of the patient and see that crescent falling down. And when you lower it, you see it coming back. This is a very, very good technique. It is called Shah's technique. The paper was described almost in 1991. It's a very simple technique. When you see the fluid level falling and fluid level coming back, And if there is any intravascular, because when you apply aspiration, you're applying negative pressure.
Right.
And causing that negative pressure, you're going to, make the vessels collapse on your orifice and you may not get it. And that may be a false negative. However, when you lower the other end of the catheter, the free flow of the fluid kind of gives you a very confirmed status that you are not in the intravascular space. So it's one of the good technique that can be applied very easily after you place the catheter in. So just wanted to kind of add on to that.
Sir, I saw it in one. I just want to say I saw it. I only used to see the menisci going down as part of it. I used to follow half the technique. And I think I saw it in a workshop where you conducted. And from that time on, we've been following it as well.
So it is important to see the menisci falling down. And I actually take it 2 steps further. Let the menisci fall down by about 10 centimeter and then get it down and let the 10 centimeter flush come back. That means if your menisci has fallen by 10 centimeter in the catheter, everything is gone into the epidural space or whichever space it is. So then when the 10 centimeter empty space is filled up by the fluid, what is coming out at the patient's entry point on the skin is what was actually at the tip of the catheter.
Okay.
So then you know exactly what is coming out from the tip. And if there is any redness or any red color coming out there, you know you're definitely not intravascular space. I also make this very, very important that if suppose the flow is not good, or even if suppose it is not red, I don't get satisfied. I make sure that the flow is good, because that also confirms that my tip is more in the center than in one side getting embedded between the tissue where the flow may not be good and then my spread may be affected. So I go one step forward and make sure that the catheter is pulled to a certain level, that the flow is also good and not and it is clear fluid. So it's a very, very good technique, very simple, practical, and can be used both the ways.
Okay. Yes,
Even
sir.
Abhinav, thank you. Really good point. Can I just add, reiterate what Abhinav mentioned about reinforced catheters?
Of course.
Yes,
And we
thank
have
you.
data- sorry, we have data again looking at reinforced versus non-reinforced, and the blood taps are certainly much less with reinforced, including paresthesia also. Really, really very useful. If you can get that, that's good. That's one. And second is, Abhinav, you can tell me about this length of the catheter in the space. If it's more than 4 centimeters, the chance of intravascular placement is high. These are 2 things which I wanted to mention. Thank you.
I agree. I agree about the lack of paresthesias. And I had a comment about looking at the meniscus. If and when you get started using if you start using a reinforced catheter, it'll be very hard for you to see a meniscus, because it's going to be hidden behind the wires. It'll make it harder, but it's definitely a good method. We used to use that if we suspected potential intrathecal placement, to drop the catheter tip below the level of the plane of the bed to see if there's any flow back. If we had trouble thinking that, if we had issues with thinking about it, but we've never tried it to see if it obviously it works. You guys are using it. It may be a good method to start following, at least in limited numbers, when to say. And I want to hear what Ketan had to say about it being one-sided, unilateral, and how it affected the drop in the meniscus. Can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, what I said was that when I drop the catheter below the level of the patient's back and see the fluid coming back, if the flow is not smooth and good enough, I will not be satisfied that the flow is clear and there is no blood coming at, but I might withdraw by another half a centimeter or a centimeter to make sure the flow is smooth and flowing easily, so that it kind of gives me a little more confirmation that the tip of the catheter or the orifices are in the midline and not kind of embedded in one of the sides or not gone laterally, where there may be a tissue crunch, and then when I give my dose, there may be a spread issue or there may be a unilateral block. And actually, I've experienced that when I've actually taken it for granted that doesn't matter, as long as there's no blood, let me just give it, I almost end up with a little unilateral or a one-sided block. So I actually have taken this into one step further in my practice, whereby I make sure that the flow is very good and smooth.
I got a notification that we are running over our time. So thank you very much for repeating that. Appreciate it.
Okay, I am going to talk about the wet tap. there was already a question somebody asked in the beginning. What to do when there is an accidental dural puncture tap, and that's what the whole talk is about. So that's why we didn't answer that question earlier. Now I've just divided very simply, practically. You are doing an epidural and you end up having a wet tap. Now wet tap can be two things. Either you get the CSF coming straight from the needle, or you get it coming from the catheter. So let's see what happens with the needle. Our classic training is the moment you see a CSF coming from the needle, we'll pull the needle out. That's what the classic training is, because it's like a knee-jerk reaction. Just remove the needle. Oh shit, I've done an epidural. I've done a dural puncture. The thinking has changed, and now people are started talking about threading intrathecal catheter. So if you've done a dural puncture accidentally, you can thread your epidural catheter into the intrathecal space and make it work like a continuous spinal anesthesia. So basically, these are the two options that has been kind of advocated. I have slightly different approach, and I would suggest that you all give a little thought on that. So once if I encounter accidental dural puncture, I will stop, breathe, and first thing I'll do is that I will put the stylet back into the needle. By doing that, what I've done is I've stopped that CSF flow. The Niagara is stopped in front of me, so I can breathe. Now I have to think of my options. Either I can recite the epidural, or I can thread the epidural. Now the threading or reciting will depend on the clinical situation and your infrastructure, whether you are prepared, whether your institute is comfortable dealing with intrathecal catheters. Do you know how to manage intrathecal catheters and things like that? So what would you do between the two would depend on your individual circumstances. But what you should do is the option 3. And what is the option 3? You have already caused a puncture in the dura. Your needle is in the intrathecal space. What you do is give an intrathecal dose of the CSE. You've all heard about the CSE technique. You all know that CSE technique, we give intrathecal dose. So give 0.5 milligram of, 50 to 25 mics of fentanyl, that is half a cc of fentanyl, and half a cc of 0.5% bupivacaine, your spinal, heavy bupivacaine, half a cc. Okay, so it's 5 milligram of bupivacaine with 25 microgram of fentanyl. You give it intrathecally through the needle, wait for a second, applying pressure on the plunger so that the CSF doesn't kind of wash that thing out. And then you can take your call whether you're going to recite or thread. So that's a very simple but effective way, because the advantage of doing this is that your patient will get immediate pain relief. So your purpose is sorted, which means if you're going to recite the epidural, your patient is going to be more comfortable, will give you a better position. You will be in a better situation. There'll be more cooperation from the patient, and you'll be in a better position to recite this catheter as opposed to somebody who's in pain screaming and you already wasted half an hour for that. So this is something that we normally recommend, that follow option 3 as a first option, and then you choose your option between reciting and threading the catheter. If you get a CSF coming from the catheter, once you've already done the epidural, your needle was fine, and you started threading the catheter, and by accident, you punctured the dura with your catheter. So what are you going to do? Again, it's a question. And here the answer, as I said, it depends on your experience, your infrastructure, the manpower available. If you're going to keep this catheter intrathecally, you must label the catheter prominently. Every dose should be given by the anesthesiologist only as a test dose. Every dose is a test dose. Physical presence of the anesthetist in this particular situation is excellent, is absolutely mandatory, and it's the best monitor. And always beware of concealed wet taps or catheter migration. So whenever there is a doubt, make sure that you are vigilant and remove the catheter if there's any slightest doubt, if you're not comfortable in your situation. So just once again, from the poster that we have produced, these are the two standard options that we have. Either you thread the catheter and manage as a continuous spinal anesthesia, maintaining strict asepsis, labeling it clearly, and all handling and top-ups only by the anesthetist, or you can remove the catheter and recite. And again, in that situation also, the top-up should be given by the anesthetist. Here I want to mention one particular point that has been missed out throughout the day up till now is that a technique called DPE, that is dural puncture epidural, is also been introduced recently. I would say recently, but it's been more than 5-7 years now that they are talking about, wherein you are doing a CSE, you're puncturing the dura, but you're not giving intrathecal dose, leaving the hole in the dura and then doing an epidural and allowing the epidural dose to seep through the dural hole into the intrathecal space. And they say that that is a better technique in terms of onset, spread of the local anesthetics and analgesia compared to the simple epidural technique. And I am not going to go into detail about the pros and cons, but what I'm saying is that when you do an epidural after an accidental dural puncture, you are also running this kind of a situation. So this is just to kind of conclude that your options are either to resite or thread, but before you do that, at least give your intrathecal dose so that your patients are comfortable and you have some time to breathe and then carry on further. I'm going to stop now. And if there is any questions from anybody or the panelists, we can discuss that.
Yeah. Okay. So the topic is about the PDPH. Now, it's going to be a very short presentation, and I would like to have more discussion rather than presentation. The PDPH definition has changed slightly. I mean, one of the criteria which we used to put in the definition that you should have orthostatic component to diagnose PDPH. So that's the slight change in the ICHD new definition, which came out in 2018. That obviously everything else remains same, but we don't require to have orthostatic component there. Accompanying symptoms with the PDPH remain the same: photophobia, tinnitus, nausea, vertigo, and neck stiffness. The incidence of PDPH is roughly between 1.5 to 11.2%, depending upon the size of the needle used and the type of the needle used. The dural puncture, accidental dural puncture, the incidence is much lesser, is 1.5%, irrespective of what type of needle you use. You have to understand one very, very important thing, that every headache after epidural does not mean it is PDPH. There's a huge amount of differential diagnosis, right from very benign to very not benign, very difficult ones. Migraine, lactational headache, tension headache, cluster headache, and so on. I mean, I would like to have more discussion. That's why I'm not mentioning everything here. But you have to understand that the dreadful things such as subarachnoid hemorrhage or cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which itself can be complication of the dural puncture of the PDPH. We all know the pathophysiology of PDPH. It is nothing but low tension headache because of the CSF leak and accompanying vasodilatation. So the nerves come into action and then we get headache. The risk factors we all know are nulliparous, younger, women who has had vaginal delivery, with morbid obesity, questionable, but probably yes. Previous history of PDPH and multiple dural punctures. The complications of PDPH can go on, but the note are continuation of diplopia and hearing loss, which in rare cases can be permanent, very important for you to know. The cranial nerve palsies, subdural hematoma, and cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. The management, I'm definitely not going to talk everything in detail because we would like the panelists and as well as the delegates to participate in this. But the outline of management is bed rest, again, questionable, hydration, questionable, analgesia, caffeine, intrathecal morphine, prophylactic saline, but very important blood patch, newer modalities to come across the problem of the PDPH. That's all I have to say, and I would really like to have more of a discussion now.
Not yet. So Sandeep, I have to ask you.
Yes.
You have presented very nicely what the PDPH is and what are the issues. But practically speaking, suppose you did an epidural today, and after 48 hours, the obstetrician calls you up and says, "Can you just go and see this patient because she's not very happy and she's got some kind of a headache." How will you proceed?
First and foremost, I should be honest to myself. I should clearly know whether I have caused a dural puncture. And if I have caused a dural puncture, the suspicion of PDH should be extremely high on my mind. If I'm very sure that I have not caused dural puncture, and there are very rare instances that the catheter has migrated, if I have done CSE, if I first of all don't do CSE much, but theoretical chances that the epidural had migrated, again, I would have known whether the epidural had migrated because I should be present throughout the labor and manage the labor analgesia. So that also I probably would safely rule out. And then I'll start thinking about differential diagnosis. Having said that, if I've caused dural puncture headache, that will be one of my topmost diagnoses. And then I'll examine the patient thoroughly. Although it is not a requirement in a definition, but the orthostatic component does play into, because that definitely happens in PDPH. Another condition where the postural component happens is the intracranial hypotension, which is caused by probably tearing of the dura in especially thoracic space, not the lumbar space, because lumbar space, the dura is is actually quite thicker than in thoracic space. I will examine the patient for the cranial nerve palsies. I will, of course, take the full history and see the associated signs like neck stiffness, diplopia, photophobia, tinnitus, and then I will come to diagnosis. I will reassure the patient. I will take the full blame. I'll be very honest that if I have caused dural puncture, I should have told them straight away anyway, and I'll take the full blame, but I'll reassure the patient thoroughly, and I'll manage the patient. I'll not sky away. There is a lot of communication issues, and we require to be absolutely thorough in our communication. And I would proceed with my standard management, which is I will ask the patient not to thoroughly take the bed rest for 24 hours. I mean, she should ambulate to go to toilet. She should be able to nurse the baby. She should be able to feed the baby. But as far as possible, if she can be in the bed, take plenty of fluids, like 1.5 to 3 liters a day. I normally give them full course of analgesics, such as NSAIDs. I do have some faith in caffeine. I try that. And then if nothing has failed, I will have anyway laid the plan. I will proceed with epidural blood patch. There are quite a few other things which one can do, but I told you what I normally do in my practice.
Abhinav, would you want to kind of add something or have your practice anything different if you were to kind of deal with a patient? Sorry, you muted yourself. Abhinav, you muted yourself. Yeah.
I basically agree with Sandeep. If it's well, a lot of things depend on the patient, right? Because a good number of times the patient doesn't want another procedure. Most of them are scared to have another procedure that actually caused the problem. It's like, you got the headache because of this, I'm going to get another pat. No, you're not going to touch my back is what they probably are thinking. But they come around because the headache's nasty. It takes everything out of their lives, the newborn, the family and everything. But if it's a recognized dural puncture, we would have basically primed them and said the chances that you get a headache are high. So it can be treated. You don't have to suffer through this. Yes, it's another procedure. We regret that it happened, but it's part of the whole process of the epidural. That's part of the preoperative consent process for us. We tell them about the headache and how we can treat them and how it entails another procedure. We tend not to delay placing a blood patch. We try to do it as soon as they complain of, so as soon as we're sure it's a dural puncture headache, especially if it's with a recognized puncture, we usually tell them, I think it probably curative in over 80% of cases, the first blood patch, so you might as well get it. We're going to give you some pain medicine. We tend to not give caffeine unless we are not sure about this headache while we investigate whether they're hypertensive, whether they're caffeine deficient, whether they have other symptomatology. Then we try to place them, we give them some fluid, we give them some pain relief medication. We try and go as quickly as we possibly can to the post postpartum floor and place the epidural, or if we cannot go and we're busy, we bring them over to the labor and delivery and place the dural patch, epidural blood patch. But usually all this ends up with the patient's reluctance and so on, usually takes about 24 hours before they actually are willing to get a blood patch. So we tend not to delay it. There are some people that hold out, for who we tell them, if you don't want a blood patch, we have other options. We'll try and give you some fluid. We'll try and give you some caffeine. We'll give you additional pain medication and see where it goes. But if they start having secondary symptoms like stuffed ears, diplopia, headache that's persistent, nausea, vomiting, we go ahead and medically recommend a blood patch. And we also tell them, if you break, there's a chance it'll break through in a small number of cases. If that happens, we'll yet do a second patch, and we've done a fair number of second patches. If they break through a second patch, and if everything else turns out to be negative, like all their other parameters for health, and we look for other causes for the headache. If we don't find anything, we usually send them to interventional pain people to do a blood patch under fluoroscopy. So we actually know they have the blood in the right space, in the right spot. In those cases, we usually get neurology involved if there's a persistent headache. That's what we end up doing.
So that's good, Abhinav. So if I can just summarize quickly, effectively, as far as PDPH is concerned, till date, there is no 100% treatment. Epidural blood patch is the only thing that comes to near 100%, that is giving about 70-80% relief with the first shot. The classic advice of complete bed rest, extra fluids, etc. have got no role to play in management of PDPH. Sandeep, one thing you said, whether I'll take the blame, that's very important. But I want to just clarify for the sake of the delegates that when you say I will take the blame, it's not that I will take the blame that I have made a complication. It's that I will take the blame in terms of I will confirm with them and I will confront them saying this has happened, which is likely to happen. It has supposed to be part of the consent form. It is supposed to be part of your information leaflet. Theoretically, there is always a possibility of 1% dural puncture, accidental dural puncture in this procedure. So I'm sorry. It is my apologies that this has happened to you, but it's not sorry or it's not blame that I have caused a complication. So that kind of a little clarity has to be there in your communication, and documentation is also very important. Ravi, you want to add something on that?
Now, is there a role of sphenopalatine ganglion block?
Okay, good question.
Chetan?
Can I ask? Can I answer, or you want someone to answer?
No, you can answer. It's your way.
Yes, Sandeep.
Okay,
Yes.
So actually, yeah, a very good question. Sphenopalatine ganglion block, very easy to do. I mean, literally, you take a long kind of not a needle but a stick, and apply cotton wool on that, on top of that, and just put some lignocaine and just insert to the inside the nose and ask the patient to inhale deeply. The idea is to go to the middle turbinate, and the sphenopalatine ganglion block can work. I have done it only once, to be honest. So I am not the authority to talk about the sphenopalatine ganglion block efficacy, but the literature does say that they have used it. And the only reason I did that, because I do a fair bit of chronic pain, and the patient had refused the blood patch. So I had given her two options. One is occipital nerve block, and second is sphenopalatine ganglion block. And when she said that I'm going to go near her head, she said no. So that's the reason I went near her nose.
Okay, Sandeep, that's a very good kind of answer on sphenopalatine ganglion block. The literature says that number one, it's a temporary relief. It's not a permanent relief. It only buys the time. So those patients who say we will not have it done, you may put the block and it kind of gives you 1 or 2 days. You can do it once and twice. And by the time the natural history of the disease, the hole starts sealing itself and it appears that the ganglion block has worked and patient has felt better. So it is not actually a therapeutic. It buys you time, number one. Number two, unless you are comfortable and you have got right gadgets to do it, I would recommend not to do it with this just little stick and a cotton wool, because I will tell you my personal experience. When I read this block for the first time, I read the anatomy, I understood everything, and I thought it was very simple to do it. So I use the cotton bud that we use to clean the ear, okay, on my own self, and try to put it and see how easy it is or how difficult or how kind of traumatic or discomfortable it is for the patient. And after putting it, when I was trying to remove it, I thought that the cotton was slightly actually threader when it came out. So it's a very, very dangerous and hazardous thing if you actually don't have a right equipment to do the block, in terms of having a cotton, you know, applying manually yourself and then trying to put it on the patient nose. And when you remove the tip and you realize that the cotton has just stayed back. So it's something that one has to be extremely careful. What
So,
I suggest,
you don't shove it through. I mean, as I said, like, I'm not the expert. I've done only once. But as I said, like, I mean, you don't shove it through. What you do is you just put it inside the nose and ask the patient to inhale deeply, so that whatever the liquid you have put in, I mean, lignocaine, is just trickles down and it goes to the middle terminate.
correct, but that is going to be difficult. That is going to be difficult with the cotton, because it will have only limited amount of absorption and it will not keep trickling as easily. So what my point is, the way they describe doing the block is to put the tip right at the end and kind of rub it on the ganglion so that it works there directly. But what I suggest, or I also read another place where if you use a 20 gauge Gelco, the intracath, without the needle, that plastic tube, then what you can do is what you suggested. Patient can be lying on their back and you can put the Gelco in, and through the Gelco about 0.75 ml in each nostril, you can keep dripping with your syringe as a drop by drop and keep telling patients to inhale and take deep breaths. So then that will probably be a safer in terms of, my only concern was that cotton tip should not get dislodged or get, displaced and cause another problem where we are trying to solve one problem.
Sir, I just want to add a point here.
Sure.
Sometimes it is easier to convince the patient and talk. We think this is a situation which gets our non-technical skills to come into action. To deal with the difficult obstetrician also will be shifting blame on you.
You will get your answer when we go into the communication skill, and when you see what
Right.
difficult things can do for you. So
What is the role of cosyntropin, sir? Do you use regularly?
Abhinav, you want to answer that?
Hello? I didn't hear your question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Dr. Abhinav, the role of cosyntropin, are you using it?
No, we've never used it. We've never done I've never done a spinopellatine block either. We usually end up doing, our first fallback is an epidural blood patch. It so rarely fails. And the second one, they're just so much better. And then, so we haven't resorted to anything else but fluid, NSAIDs, epidural blood patch, some caffeine, and a second epidural blood patch, or a third one in very, very few cases. In all these years, I've only had 2 people that needed a third blood patch. So Actar gel, Syncotro, we haven't used any.
Ravi, you want to say about cosyntropin?
No, I have no practical experience about it at all. I have not used it, so I wouldn't like to.
Yeah, I can just tell you something. Again, I don't have practical experience. I've used it only in 3 patients, so that would be not kind of my experience. But what literature I've read and what I've discussed with Dr. Bhavani Shankar Kodali, who unfortunately could not be with us today, is that cosyntropin was started as a very promising drug, and to a level that there was one stage where they were saying that cosyntropin is so good that for every spinal anesthesia that you give for a cesarean section, you should give them prophylactic cosyntropin to prevent post-dural puncture headache. Then, over a period of time, the later on studies have kind of revealed that it is again not more than 20 to 25% success rate. And effectively, I think it is all falling into the same group of you can try this and you can try that and buy time and let the nature heal the cause. So there is no definite role of cosyntropin, but it is something that you can use. It is not, it is non-invasive compared to your epidural blood patch. And it also makes your patients feel that yes, something is being done. but these are all modalities or all kind of things that you can use in first 24 to 48 hours. And as Dr. Abhinav said, putting the idea of doing epidural patch on your first visit itself when you see a patient with PDPH, and give them 24 to 48 hours to think while you're giving other things to work. And if they don't work, don't delay the epidural blood patch. And as there was one fantastic article which says, prevent the first, but definitely treat the second. So don't kind of delay the treatment. Dr.
Ketan, can I say something here?
Yes, Sandeep.
I'm sorry, we may be running short of time, but I think I should say this. So when there are some people for who you do anything, yeah, and one of them is wife. So my experience with ACTH analog cosintropin is with my wife. I myself happen to be an anesthetist for arthroscopy, and this happened in Singapore. And unfortunately, she landed up in PDPH, and you cannot believe it, but it literally started on the same evening. And I had used 27 gauge. My wife is quite thin, but whatever it is, she had full-blown PDPH. So I had tried everything. She said that I will divorce you if you again touch my back. So blood patch was ruled out. And in Singapore, I tried to get everything, whatever possible. And I did get ACTH, and I gave her 1 milligram IV. It didn't, I don't know whether it helped or not, but as you said, that she thought that I was doing everything I can. Unfortunately, she had to have another arthroscopy on the another knee. And this time I gave her epidural. Believe me or not, I didn't do the spinal, but I had taken the verbal consent that if I happen to do a dural patch, I'm sure I'll end up in divorce.
What to do for epidural top-up if they're coming for a cesarean section? These are the key questions which we need to address, which is number one, or probably the most important, is your epidural working? The reason why this is important is the commonest reason for general anesthesia in obstetric population today is failed epidural top-up for urgent or emergency cesarean section. So what do you mean by epidural which is not working? I think the most recent definition is, in addition to all the patchy block and all, if you have had to give 3 manual top-ups if somebody is on a PIAV or a PCEA. So if you had to top it up more than 3 times, when called that patient is in pain for more than 3 times, that means there is a big question mark that your epidural is working. And the safest thing, I think this is what Abhinav was trying to tell earlier, is don't top it up for cesarean section, take it out, put a straightforward spinal in. So that's one. So first question is epidural working or not? If it's working, top it up. Otherwise, take it out, do a single short spinal. Second is, where do we start the top-up? I don't know how we are set up. We have birthing center rooms, labor rooms, and we have an OR, which is on the same floor. As soon as the patient comes to OR, and there is a mad rush to get cesarean section started. So we have a tendency, or we start topping up the epidural in the labor ward itself, and as the patient is moving, not full top-up, but gradual top-ups. So what do we do before we do the top-up? We test what is the initial level of block. We make sure the patient is continuously monitored, which is CTG and vitals, and we do gradual top-ups. So that is number 2. Third question which we're trying to answer is what medications to use. There are 3 or 4 medications which traditionally are being used, but the recent meta-analysis came up with 2 which are being commonly used, at least in the United Kingdom. One is lignocaine with epinephrine or adrenaline, and second is ropivacaine. These are the 2 most commonly used medications for epidural top-up, at least in the United Kingdom. Lignocaine 2% with epinephrine 1 in 200,000 or 50 mg per ml. The advantage with this is it gives very quick onset. So within literally 5 to 10 minutes, you have a block which is ready to go. So if you have a very urgent section or a category 1 section, you can start topping up the room. By the time they actually come to the OR, they're ready to go. So you avoid giving general anesthesia. If you have time, then you can top it up with ropivacaine, and that's absolutely okay. What is most important is probably how do you test the block. I'm not sure how from what I've heard, you're testing it with cold, with spirit, or with pinprick. Is that correct? So whatever you test, make sure the block is adequate, both for cold and for pain, at least up to T4 before we start. Last thing we want is start the surgery and then having to convert into general anesthesia halfway through. And be ready for failure. As I already mentioned, the commonest reason for general anesthesia in urgent section is the failed epidural top-up or an epidural which was not working well, topped up, and surgery is allowed to. So happy to take questions. Thank you.
So Dr. KK, I want to ask you one question. Your patient is in labor, you've given an epidural. Patient complained of pain, you've just topped up the epidural, and now within 10 minutes, delivering normally, we need to do cesarean. You've just given her analgesia dose and made her comfortable. Now that you are going to take this patient in less than half an hour to the OT, how much and what will you give now to get the block working for your cesarean?
Okay. The answer is, as I said, first is what is the level of block you have in the labor room or BC, and then you do graduate your top-ups till you get an adequate block up to T4. So it's not, each patient is different. You may need 5 ml, you may need 10 ml, you may need 15 ml. So use 2% lidocaine or lignocaine with epinephrine. That's our standard top-up mixture. So we give 5 ml each time, recheck the block, 5 ml, recheck the block. If you're getting an adequate block to T4, that's good.
Do you use fentanyl with it, KK?
Yes, yes, fentanyl definitely. I'm sorry I didn't mention that.
How much?
Use of fentanyl is very, very beneficial. We use up to 50 to 100 micrograms of fentanyl in epidural and flush it with saline to make sure it's actually in the space.
I welcome Dr. Sunil here to the
Hi.
forum.
Yes, Dr. Sunil, welcome.
My workshop just got over, so I thought I'll just keep on to yours.
Yeah, you join at the right time. We're going to start the communication and panel discussion. You might as well stay on if you're tired. Okay.
I'm a silent bystander.
Okay, KK, just to continue what you said, my understanding is that when we are doing a labor epidural or when we're giving an analgesic dose, we are using a very low quality, I mean rather low concentration. So we are only kind of blocking the
Correct.
sensory block. So when a surgery is required, you need to give a motor block. So in my opinion, as Dr. Felicity Reynolds always used to say, we are on the same fence. So I would actually be very comfortable giving 10 to 15 ml of my cesarean dose, even though I have given my analgesic dose in half an hour without worrying about total spinal or high spinal or high epidural, because I am not actually adding on to extra nerves. I'm blocking the same nerves and penetrating them deeper to cause the motor block. Of course, as we've always been saying throughout this workshop, that we will be always giving in a graded manner and we'll be using incremental dose. In every dose is a test dose, but it is to kind of bring to the attention that just because you have given an analgesic dose less than half an hour, you most likely or most unlikely are going to get away with only a 5 ml extra dose for doing a complete cesarean. This is my personal opinion. What do you say, Ravindra?
I completely agree with you, Ketan. All I'm trying to emphasize is they should not work 20 ml in the epidural because
Absolutely.
they should give graduate every 5
Yes.
ml, top up check, and make sure you have a block to T4.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
think that's all
Perfect.
I'm trying.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you're right. KK, I will ask you one more question.
Yes.
Supposing you want to convert, you started your conversion, you gave 5 ml, you checked, you gave 5 ml, you checked, you gave 15 ml, and you checked, and the sensory level is T4. Okay. Now you allow the surgeon to go ahead with the surgery. She puts the incision, and when the peritoneum is being opened, that is when supposing she is not very comfortable. Would you give ketamine at this time to tide over the crisis? This is
Or
one thing which,
propofol.
do
Or
you give it?
propofol.
Bit of propofol or ketamine, or what will you do?
Do we, if the baby is stable, do we have time for epidural top-up, IV fentanyl or IV ketamine? Propofol is a no-no from my side.
Okay.
One of these
Ketamine?
three, whatever the situation allows. So if I have time for epidural top-up, I will top up further. IV fentanyl, because we are given epidural fentanyl, we can top up with IV fentanyl or ketamine. These are the three.
Sensory level is T4 already.
Okay.
But the peritoneal stimulation.
I don't think we should
is
advocate giving propofol. Definitely not in a conference. I don't think we should.
No, I
give
know.
that.
I wanted your answer.
What do you say, Sandeep? You want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of things. First, I'll answer Dr. Ravindran's question. I agree with KK. I mean, if the level is not adequate, then I will top it up. If the level is at T4 already, if the peritoneal handling has caused pain, there will be some placebo by talking that this is going to be a bit uncomfortable. After I try to get the baby out as soon as, I mean, the obstetrician can, and I actually am quite much in favor of ketamine. I use 0.2 to 0.25 milligrams per kilogram of ketamine IV. Usually I try to give it after the baby comes out. Second thing is that the traditional, my epidural top-up dose has included everything what KK said. 2% lignocaine, 1 in 200,000 of adrenaline or epinephrine nowadays we say, 50 to 100 micrograms of fentanyl. But it also has 2 milliequivalents of sodium bicarbonate, 8.4%, which is just 2 ml of the bottle use of 10 ml of sodium bicarbonate. And that gives you an excellent, faster analgesia. That's just my practice. I used to have that in my pocket actually whenever I used to be on call in Sidra with KK. He knows that.
Can I ask Sunil to answer this question? Sunil, are you there?
I think he's logged in, but he's probably busy with something else.
It's okay. It's okay. Forget about it. Right. Anything else, Ketan?
I don't see any question in chat box. If the delegates have any question, they can put some
No,
questions.
I have one more question.
Yes, please.
Supposing your conversion fails, you have a total failure. You want to give general anesthesia. Will you use an LMA to induce, to give a general anesthetic for a cesarean section, or you would intubate?
Sandeep, can I take this?
Yes.
Yes, please, KK. I mean, I'll share my experience and please go ahead, please.
No, my plan A would be to intubate, especially it's an urgent or emergency cesarean section. So patient has been on opioids in labor, delayed gastric emptying. So plan A would be intubate.
Okay.
If the intubation fails, I would go for a second generation supraglottic airway. So my plan A will definitely not be LMA.
Okay. Now that's what I wanted. I wanted people to know that. See if
just one second. Sunil has just joined in. Sunil.
Yeah.
There was a question of whether you would use ketamine or propofol if the patient complains of discomfort during cesarean after opening the peritoneum under epidural.
See, basically, again, ketamine and propofol, how much you use is important because both are like ketamine will abolish upper airway reflexes, so also propofol. So you need to define like how severe is the pain. Like suppose if just momentary, probably I'll just give fentanyl. And suppose if you feel fentanyl is insufficient to relieve your pain, then probably putting a tube will be a safer option. So you need to define how well is your block is just at rectus sheath pain when they're separating, or it's just a failed block or a partial block, or what level of block you have achieved. Suppose if the block is of low level and it's going to require more propofol, like more than 50 milligrams of propofol or more than 20 milligrams of ketamine, then it's not advisable to go on using cocktail and little bit of this, little bit of that.
Thank you, Sunil.
Yeah.
That's the message that we wanted to get across the delegates, because here the experts are there who have had worked for longer number of years and they can actually judge how much to give and when to stop. But you know, as a delegate or as a new person or a junior sitting in the delegates room, if you kind of give a little propofol and you give 50 ml and say, okay, I'll give another 10 and I'll give another 20, and you lose the control of the airway at some stage and then end up with a catastrophe. So I always say bit of that and bit of this is a perfect recipe for disaster. So that is something that everybody has to be aware of.
Okay. Now I think we'll move on, Ketan.
So there is one question in the chat box.
Yeah.
Which is how much volume of lignocaine with adrenaline or ropivacaine you will give for the top up for cesarean? I think it has been already answered. But Sandeep or KK, you want to answer that?
KK, you want me to take this or you want to take this?
Yeah, sure, Sandeep, go ahead.
Okay, so as we mentioned previously, we need to check the level of the block. If you have already had a good level of block, my standard dose is around 15 ml of 2% lignocaine with 1 in 200,000 of adrenaline, 50 to 100 micrograms of fentanyl, and 2 milligrams per 20 ml of sodium bicarbonate. So I normally give 15 ml and wait. And if the block is not adequate, I go for another 5 ml, which is 20 ml.
So I think that answers the questions. Any more questions? Anything? I don't see anything in the chat box.
Or whether you can give morphine for labor analgesia. Did you see that question in the chat box?
Yes.
We did answer.
Okay, it was
You
answered.
want to answer that?
No,
You
no,
want to answer it, Sunil?
no, obviously.
Yeah. Sunil's answer is simple in 2 words, not even 2 words, just 1 word. Which we already discussed. Yes, thank you.
Anything else?
Nothing more in the chat books, I guess.
Yeah, I think most of the questions in the chat box has been answered.
Right.
Ravindran,
Yes.
can I just add one more thing about this morphine, which has been going on for some time now?
Yes, please.
The only indication I see about giving morphine intra-epidurally will be when you have had a dural puncture. So there is some data that when you give intrathecal, when you give epidural morphine 3 milligram, the PDPH rates were a bit low. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Still again, question mark. Yeah, I think, shall we move on, Ketan?
Yes. So you want to start off with the communication part of it?
Yes.